Hi, I'm Taylor, and on this week's I Made a Thing video, I'm going to be trying a little bit of a different format, so bear with me while I work on building a maple slab desk. But before I get started actually turning this into a desk, I wanted to make sure I got the proportions right. So, using some cardboard, I just started laying out a mock-up. Using big sheets of cardboard is nice. You can get them, from a home center, or I happen to get mine because I bought a new refrigerator. And the big benefit is that you can iterate on a design over and over pretty cheaply. I grabbed some of my tools from my desk, a little mock keyboard and a mouse, so that I could get a sense for how much space I'd want the desk to have in front of me before I had it curve over into that signature L shape you get in these sorts of desks. And here I'm just marking out a couple different options of depth so I could start feeling out where I want these two pieces to join together. Once the cardboard mock-up had determined the dimensions I wanted to be working within, I used this wood frame to actually mark out where on the slab I would be getting the components that would then become the desktop. My main objective here was to maximize how much of the desk would actually be wood so that I don't have to use a lot of epoxy to put this thing together. Once I had it laid out, I grabbed my track saw. You could do this with a circular saw on a straight edge or a hand saw if you really want to, but I just started making sequential cuts. The track saw is probably powerful enough to cut through this in one pass, but I wasn't having a luck without it burning. So, did a couple passes, and then once I reached the maximum depth, I pulled out a handsaw and finished off the cuts. And I did the same thing along the long edge as well. I'm not sure why my dust collection was so bad for this cut, but man, that is blowing it everywhere. One of the things I ran into was because I was releasing a lot of tension, I had to put some wedges in to finish these cuts, but it wasn't too big of a hassle. Finish off the corner of the top, I took one of those offcuts and brought it to the bandsaw to section off this piece here that I liked the figuring of. And here I'm just roughly cutting what would be the corner. And then you can see, I like the way that fit. I kind of like that stripe that's going across the middle. We'll come back to that stripe in a little bit, but for now, I like the way it looked, so it was time to start really cleaning up the faces here. These were still rough cut slabs. I hadn't gone and smoothed them out or planed them flat, so there was some leftover sawdust and grit. And I'd also seen, it looked like there was like mold or something going on in here. I was a little bit worried about that, so I pulled out my sander with a pretty aggressive grit on it and just went over that spot to see if maybe that was only surface deep. Luckily, you can see here the part that I sanded versus the part that I didn't sand. You can't see any of those specks, and spoilers, in the end, it looks like it was just surface level. So I set to prepping the rest of it, looking for any knots and holes that might have some loose debris, and clearing those out. Oh, and remember that cool line I was talking about in that cutoff piece? Well, oops. It wasn't a line, it was a big bark inclusion, so there goes that. Before I did the first deep pour, I'm going to use this penetrating epoxy here to harden up some of the soft spots, as well as seal the edges of the board itself, so that the wood doesn't start to bubble and I don't have to worry about that in the deep pour itself. Here I'm just trying to soak it into any of those nooks and crannies that I'm going to be pouring more epoxy into later, and I use it for filling in some of the smallest voids. You don't want to use a penetrating really thin epoxy like this for filling big voids, but for small cracks, it works out okay. I was really surprised how much darker the wood got after putting on that epoxy, but you'll see here there's kind of weird faded spots. That's where it was really soaking up a lot of that penetrating epoxy, so I gave it a couple more coats. Once I was done, I started getting my forms ready. Here's just melamine, and I was going to try out a couple different techniques. The first one here is I took a bunch of packing tape and painstakingly covered the entire sheet of melamine with it. It took way too long. I will not be using this method again for that reason and for reasons, well, you'll see in a little bit. But then once I had the bottom prepped, put the sides on, I laid down a bead of caulk, hopefully to prevent any leaks, And then I screwed the whole thing together. Drilling pilot holes was really important for the melamine because otherwise it really liked to crack and split. Same with countersink the holes because I was using flared screws at the ends. And then I put this drill perfectly in place to cover the shot of me screwing in the screws. So great job, Taylor. But if you want proof, here's a different angle of me putting in some other screws where I'd countersunk it, and see there, now it's flush and nothing split. For the smaller second piece, I opted to just use paste wax on the form to see if I could get that from sticking instead of using something like mold release. And I gotta say, it ends up working really well. But one mistake I did make here is, as I mentioned, I didn't pre-flatten these boards before doing the pour. And you can see there's that small gap in the bottom right here, which surely couldn't possibly end up being a huge pain later, right? Well, no. See, that small gap is across almost the entire bottom of that board, and it ends up eating probably 1/4 gallon of epoxy on its own. Speaking of which, this is the epoxy I'm using, this deep pour. This is just what they had in store at Rockler. I don't have any particular brand affiliation. I've tried several epoxies, and this one works as well as the others I've tried. But it's a 3-to-1, and for this first one I just poured the entire gallon because I knew I was going to use at least that much, and it helped me get a feel for how much more I was going to need to buy. And for some reason, I also filmed all of this using the slow motion setting on my camera, so you get to watch this swirl nice and slowly. See? Whoa, shiny. Alright, this footage had no reason to be in slow motion, but I don't know, I thought it was kind of neat. But it's more fun once I actually throw the dye in. Here, let's switch to that clip. There. See, now the dye's in there and you get to see it swirl. Ooh, cool. Pretty. As far as the dye itself, it was just a trans tint. I think it's an alcohol dye. I'll put it in the link if I find it. But I put about 40 drops per gallon. I wanted this to be quite dark black, and I was being careful about measuring it. Once that was there, I then poured it into the form itself. You can see I've got some cauls holding the slab down just in case it wanted to try and float. This did help keep some of the epoxy from seeping underneath, but again, I really should have flattened these first. And there was one small leak that tried to happen, but nothing I couldn't deal with by just putting another clamp on the board and squeezing that caulk down in place. And I tried to get some action shots of popping bubbles with the heat gun, but they don't really show up well as black epoxy on a camera. But trust me, they were there and they were popped. The next morning, it was already dry because there was a pretty thin layer, so I just scuffed it up with some sandpaper, cleaned it out, and got ready to do the next layer's pour. And here I poured a little bit deeper this time, ended up being, I think for the entire table, something close to 3.5 gallons of epoxy just for that small section. Again, I think it's because a lot of it seeped underneath the slab, where if I had milled it flat, stuck it in the form, it probably would have saved me some costs, because this epoxy stuff, turns out it's not cheap. But I let this sit for, I think, 3 days. Basically, I let it sit over the weekend and let it cure up. The moment of truth came when I was going to see if my cauls were going to actually come off of the table. And luckily, some packaging tape as the barrier worked really well. They popped right off, and it also worked really well for the sides of the form. I was very excited that they just popped right out. Now, for the small form, I had just, again, tried only beeswax, and it did not work as well. Whoop, there goes the hammer. Nicely done. Anyways, took a couple extra wax to get this off here. I think the caulk was really what was holding it still, but I was more worried that it was going to be this difficult to get it off of the bottom, and nope, not going to be an issue. Popped right out. So, good news there, but you can already see there's about 1/8 of an inch thick layer of epoxy across the entire bottom of this slab, and that comes back later to be a real pain. I was hoping the big slab would be just as easy to pull up. So I just grabbed a little spatula here, scraper thing to try and wedge it free. Yeah, no, it ended up taking a lot more. I ended up having a hammer and a bunch of wedges, and then I've got this little crowbar doodad. Ended up finally wedging the thing free. So finally, I could move on to flattening it. To do that, I've got this jerry-rigged jig I've built out of linear rails I bought on Amazon, sitting on top of some 40/40 extrusion because it was otherwise too short to clear it. And then a sheet of acrylic I just cut and mounted my router to. On it, I've just got a surfacing bit that you'd buy for like a CNC. I would recommend, if you were going to do this, to buy instead one of the ones that has the carbide inserts you can remove and rotate. Because this one, that was just the fixed carbide blades, I had to sharpen several times. But that being said, it ended up working really well. Here you can see I'm just making slow passes, moving forward every time. And it's creating a pretty smooth finish. I was worried there was going to be a lot of really noticeable grooves for each pass. But really the only issue was just how much of a freaking mess this made. Because it was so uneven before I made the epoxy pour, it meant I had to cut through a lot of material to get down to just flat wood. And it was just hours. And going through the epoxy is really hard on the router. I had to keep stopping because it was literally smoking. Like this. Oh, and did I say it was messy yet? Because, good lord, going through about a ½ inch of wood and shredding the whole thing creates a lot of waste. But the finished surface looked pretty good. It wasn't perfectly smooth, but it didn't have to be. It was smooth enough that sandpaper was going to fix it. And once I did one side, got to flip it over and do it all again. Clearing out all this out of my pockets. I ended up with one. No, it was two or... you know what? It was three. It was 3 trash bags full of shavings and dust. And that wasn't even what I vacuumed. But like I said, even with some of the burn marks, once the bit was getting dull, it all sanded out really easy. Here I'm only using, I think it's 80 grit sandpaper or 120. I can't remember. Either way, it wasn't a super aggressive grit and it was coming out in a single pass. And then there were a couple soft spots that were left, like this little punky area here. So I just took some more of that penetrating epoxy and let that soak in before I moved on to the next step. Here you can see just how much it still was absorbing it with those areas of differing sheens. But once that was dry after another couple hours, I just went and meticulously started sanding. Ended up going over the whole thing about 3 or 4 times, just marking with pencil and then going section by section and sanding it and letting the sandpaper do the work. And then I cut off to get to my final dimensions of the top by just again running the track saw. This time I was able to make it in a single pass and go all the way through. No handsaw required. Once I had one straight edge, I used the big giant T-square to try and make sure that it was all going to be 90 degrees to each other. Ended up working out okay. Ooh, pretty action shot. Look at that. Still weird dust collection issues though. With everything cut to its final dimension, we're finally at a spot where I could start laying it out and seeing what this tabletop was going to look like. And here I'm just marking alignment points for where I'm going to be putting in dominoes. And if I'm marking out where dominoes are going to be coming from, that can only mean one thing. I'm going to be using the Festool domino. I don't know if it's really as contentious of a tool as it used to be, but it's still really nice to use. Ooh. Ah. However, this time, while the process may look the same, the goal is a little bit different here. I'm not just putting these dominoes in for alignment and joinery. I need this to be able to be knocked down because the desk is just too big and too heavy. So I'm using these special connectors they've devised. If you've ever built furniture from IKEA, they're going to look pretty similar. But effectively the way it works here is you've got this little metal bit here. Whoop, and I dropped it on the floor. Nice going. Let's try that again. Okay, you've got this little metal bit here that you're going to wedge into one side in the domino, and you thread in, well, okay, this is embarrassing. You actually thread it in from the other side, but don't tell past me that. He doesn't know yet. But you thread in this little guy here that has a divot in it, and in the other piece of wood, you drop in this, I don't know, hole, threaded hole, and you hold it in place with a clip, and the two pieces mate just like that, where you've got the divot is going to be underneath that threaded hole, and you just use a set screw that is somewhere in this box. Hold on, wait. Oh, yeah, there it is. And you use a set screw to tighten it down and hold the whole thing in place. There, see, now it's locked in place, so because that plastic clip would still be in the other board, and they ain't coming apart. Well, of course, until you use the Allen wrench to unscrew that screw, and then boom, comes apart super easy. In order to fit, of course, that set screw in there, you need a way to access it. So you use this drill guide that comes with the whole kit, and you chuck up a giant drill bit that they give you. Here, let me show you in just a second. Let me screw this down. Like I said, giant drill bit. But you drill out the hole. It has a nice stop guide, so you're not going to blow through the top of the board. There we go. And then you repeat this for anywhere else you want to have those little knockdown connectors. I only ended up needing 2 here because that was plenty strong, and then just using the outside dominoes for stability and strength once it's joined together. Because you don't have to have every connection point use these connectors. Little hammer in here, little tap in there, all good to go. And then before I could apply finish and do my final sanding, the last bit was just using some thin CA glue to look for any small voids and bubbles and things that I may have missed during the overall epoxy pour that would show up and mar this beautiful finish. It only took, a couple hours, but it ended up being very much worth it, because once the CA glue is cured, you can just sand it. And then for the last kind of final touch, I went and did a couple passes using a chamfering bit along the bottom of the desktop, just to try and thin the profile from the side. But I'll be honest, I don't have a big enough chamfering bit, so I don't know if the final look really was worth the mess it made. Because boy howdy, does cutting through epoxy create just a wild amount of shavings. But now, once I get this all cleaned up, it's finally time for finish. And for that finish, I'm trying out a new one, Sample 73 from Four Eyes Studios, or I guess Quirk is their selling brand. I've never used it before. This is the first project I've tried, but I just like trying out stuff that other YouTubers make. So if you want, I'll throw a link to it. I don't know when their next orders will be coming through, but so far I'm liking using it. It works just like any of the other hard wax oils you've used. Here it's a loose 3-to-1 ratio. You mix the hardener and the finish, and then you just stir it for a good while. And once you got it nice and mixed up, you put it onto the surface you're working to do and just spread it out and buff it in, and then wait a little bit and wipe off the excess. You can see the grain is just popping beautifully. The one thing that's different, because I've used Rubio before as well, is it did have a little more, I guess, tack to it. It felt a little bit thicker, I guess, when running through and buffing it out. I don't think that's a pro or a con. It just is. But here's the bottom all finished out. And then what you do on the bottom, of course, you got to do on the top. Here I've just set it on some risers so that the bottom can continue to cure. But this is definitely my favorite part of every project, is applying finish. It starts to finally feel like a completed project when you can see all of that hard work paying off and the gorgeous grain really popping. And this slab has some beautiful chatoyance in it. That dark spot my hand's going over right now has these crazy waves. But this is a spoiler here, where you're seeing kind of the rest of the desk, incomplete, of course. And you'll see more of that in my next video. I'm hoping to have that done, I don't know, in the next week or two. But this here is the tabletop itself. I'm really happy with how it turned out. I think it's just enough epoxy that lets me make it a square top without it being overdone. And it makes this slab that otherwise, I don't know if I could have used without milling it out into a bunch of boards. And then here you can see this is how I attach it using those knockdown connectors. You just line up the dominoes that'll be for support, and then the two set screw pilot stick things. I'm sure they have a real name. I don't know, but you wedge those in there, and you end up with quite a sturdy tabletop. I mean, first you gotta kind of go underneath it and screw them in, but we'll skip that part. And here, see? I can sit on... Look, Ma, no hands. Anyways, that's my big tabletop L-desk kind of dream desk build here. I've got another video coming where I build the frame underneath there with a networking cabinet. I hope you check out that video as well. Anyways, I don't know. Bye, I guess. Go make something.